if you care about employee retention and recruitment and engagement and morale and so on, if you care about these things, then you want to understand that your perspective as a leader will be just inherently different from the perspective of employees. And you want to get their feedback and input if you want to make a good decision.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 7,500 companies, 55,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Dr. Gleb is the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, a best-selling author and prolific writer often featured in Entrepreneur, Fortune, Fast Company, and other leading publications. In this episode, we get past generalities about hybrid work and get into the nitty-gritty of implementation. From using data to set policy, to revamping your communication practices to support asynchronous work, Dr. Gleb talks through a specific roadmap any organization can use to maximize the performance of their hybrid model. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Rob. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate your pronunciation of my last name.
I tried my best. I don't know if it was perfect, but hopefully it was passing grade. So one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you is you are so prolific on this topic of hybrid work and the evolution toward flexible work. I feel like not only do I see your thinking show up on a regular basis on places like LinkedIn and other social media, but you write such thoughtful, reasoned articles across a number of different platforms. I've seen your work in HBR, Entrepreneur, Fortune, Fast Company. How did you get into this world in the first place? Is this something you've been studying a long time or a more recent shift into hybrid work and flexibility?
I've always been passionate about decision making. So ever since I was a kid, I wanted to understand how and why people made their decisions. And that really stemmed from what was happening around 1999, that internet.com boom and bust. I was 18 in 1999, and there were all these .coms booming, pets.com, webvan, and so on. And they were praised. Yeah, exactly. And they were praised in the Wall Street Journal as like great decision makers, all the leaders of these companies. And then a couple of years later, when I was 21, 2001, 2002, they all went bust. And they were criticized in the Wall Street Journal. And you know what? I mean, the decision making wasn't different of these people. It was just the fact that the situation changed. And so that made me realize, we don't really know what we're doing when we talk about decision making. And so that is what caused me to study decision making, how we make our decisions and why we make our decisions this way. And the biggest area of challenge for us in decision making is, of course, the future of work. Because when we make decisions in situations, we know we can generally have previous patterns. But in new situations, we don't have previous patterns to rely on. So what we tend to do is rely on our old patterns to make decisions in new situations. And often that fails miserably. So I did some research on this. I've got a PhD on this topic of studying how we make our decisions in historical and contemporary contexts at UNC Chapel Hill. I was a professor researching this for 7 years at Ohio State. And at the same time, I was doing consulting and coaching and training for a number of companies on this topic. So I have a lot of experience with helping companies make good decisions in the future of work. And of course, working remotely in a hybrid setting, that was one of the areas of future work decision-making that I was working on long before the pandemic and became my primary focus during the pandemic, because that's just following my clients. That's what their focus was.
Got it. So is that the primary lens that you think about the future of work and flexible work? Is it around the decision that companies make in terms of how they approach it or how employees or teams operate within it? Like, what part about flexible work and the decision-making process do you find you're spending the most time on?
The psychology, yes. So how leaders think about it, how employees think about it, and the incongruity between these two. So you see a lot of leaders falling into a number of cognitive biases. Now, cognitive biases, your listeners and viewers might be familiar with this term. It's the kind of errors we make because of how our mind is wired. We're not really wired for the modern environment to connect with each other as small squares on a video conference screen. We are wired to connect in small tribes of 50 people to 150 people in the ancestral savannah. And so that's what we're wired for. Our emotions and intuitions, that's what they're wired for. So make a number of errors in the modern environment. One of these is called the status quo bias, where we get used to a certain way of dealing with situations, of modalities, and we have a lot of anxiety around changing it, especially if we're successful in that way. So kind of think about and empathize with leaders who are successful for 30, 40 years in the office. They're comfortable. They know how to do it. And they want to do what they're comfortable with. And so that is really important to understand that they're following that status quo bias, whereas employees have learned during the pandemic, they changed their habits, that they can do their work fine from home, and they don't need to do that extreme effort of going to commute, which for leaders is much less effortful because they most often might live much closer to work. So there's a lack of empathy among leaders to employees, and there's a lack of empathy from employees to leaders. That's also called the empathy gap. That's another one of our cognitive biases. And there are a number of these we can go into. But that's the underlying dynamic here, that the disagreements, tensions are because of how we think differently around these topics. Otherwise, there would be disagreements.
So it raises a really interesting question to me, which is you were describing a set of potential areas of bias that company executives, especially senior executives, might have when it comes to rethinking the paradigm of work and the future of work. At the same time, you consult with companies and work with them, and I imagine the person bringing you in needs to be an executive of some sort who is opening their mind to this change. And so does that make it hard to find the right clients who are open to it? Or do executives have enough self-awareness to realize that maybe they need to think about this differently? How does that work in practice?
Sure. Well, the general thing is that executives is not a homogeneous concept. Each company has a number of different executives. And there were some studies showing that the top cause of boardroom struggles in modern companies is actually disagreements around return to the office, flexible work, hybrid work. So it's not about recession. It's not about DI, although that gets all the news. It's not simply the tensions between employers and employees. That's the thing that gets the most headlines within RTO, return to office, hybrid work. But when I work with clients, the biggest tensions I see is among executives. Some executives, the ones who are bringing me in, just see the vision. They see the future. They're like, oh, yes, we're making some mistakes. If we want to really optimize for the bottom line, we need to think about workers, productivity, engagement, morale. That means figuring out using data and research what is actually going to be best for the company in terms of return to office, flexible work, hybrid work, which we can talk about definitions and so on. But that's far from all executives. Plenty of executives are not like that. They think that what's comfortable for me, what do I feel is the right thing, what do I want to be doing, and then the company should be doing what I want to be doing because I feel that's my intuition telling me that that's the right way to work. So there's a paradigmatic difference between how some executives see it, and there's everything in between, right? There are some executives who are like, oh, I'm very comfortable in the office, but I understand that I'm going to lose a lot of employees. So really, there's kind of tug of war. And so there's going to be some executives who are really data-driven and focused on what's going to be best for the bottom line, and being open to flexible work if that's best for the bottom line. And there are some executives who are going to be completely closed off and they're very uncomfortable. And there's a big bunch in the middle. And so many companies are just having a lot of boardroom drama around that. And I'm brought in to try to mediate that and look at the data and evidence from externally and internally and help them figure out what is going to be the best decision for the company, given the overarching goals of the company and the values that they seek to enact in their policies.
Makes sense. So what kind of companies, give us a sense a little bit of, size of company, industries, and mostly tech or non-tech, or kind of like what's the average setup, if you will, when you start working with a company on these kind of topics?
Sure. I mean, I can give you some examples of companies that I worked with. So one example of a company is called, well, this is an organization. It's called the Information Sciences Institute. So this is a Artificial Intelligence and Cybersecurity Institute associated with the University of Southern California. It's a 300-ish research institute, so with a lot of cybersecurity staff, with a lot of AI staff, researchers. And so they are very paid less than they would be at something like Amazon and Google. And so they're being poached. And the institute wanted to have a modality that would be great for their collaboration and innovation, which is incredibly important, while reducing poaching of staff. And they were able to successfully achieve this outcome through having an approach toward flexible work that aligned with the lifestyles of staff. So that's kind of one company. Another type of company would be something like Atlassian. So I worked with Atlassian to help them figure out, they're great at most aspects of flexible work. I worked with them on one specific aspect, which is helping their junior teams, so helping them integrate junior staff, which is a major challenge in remote and hybrid work settings. So that's kind of something I worked with in one company. That's a very specific engagement rather than a much broad engagement. Another company I worked with is Harding Loevner, which has about 100-ish staff, financial services firm. And that was kind of a soup to nuts from the beginning of how do you figure out what the flexible hybrid work policy for them would be that would help their staff members have the best possible outcomes in terms of what the priorities are for the leadership team, while being sufficiently flexible in terms of morale, engagement, retention. And then another company I worked with is Applied Materials, which is a Fortune 200 high-tech manufacturer in the semiconductor space. And for them, I did a number of trainings on how to do hybrid work effectively, flexible work effectively. So those are just different styles of projects. Some training, some consulting, some soup to nuts, some specific targeted ones like for Atlassian. And it really depends on what the client needs, their level of sophistication, and the kind of expertise that they want to bring in, that they want to make sure that I can mediate between different executives, because generally in all of those companies, there's disagreements among executives about what the right path forward is. And so I'm brought in to help mediate that, use data, use research to help them make the best decisions around their goals and their bottom lines.
So I'm guessing there's probably a bunch of listeners right now who are nodding their heads saying, yep, I've experienced this disagreement between executives. Maybe this is taking place right at this moment. There may be others who feel like the executive team is on the same page, but the implementation of hybrid hasn't really met what they're hoping for. They feel like there's probably a gap still in performance or capability relative to what they want. So using any of the examples used or a different one, how do you take companies through this? Like, what's the right starting point, and what are the steps along the way to go from we think we want to be hybrid maybe to this is what best in class implementation and kind of capability building around that looks like?
Sure. So yeah, let's do that. And though I can use another one, Luckett Farley. So Luckett Farley is an engineering services firm, and they have over 100 engineers. So they were trying to figure out their flexible work policy. And so what is the best approach to that? And so what I worked with them on, this is similar to the project I did with Harding Loevner and similar to the Information Sciences Institute. So this is kind of a representative of a soup to nuts approach. So what you do first is you meet with the leadership team and figure out what their vision is, what they actually want to accomplish, like what are their values, what do they want to enact in hybrid work. So for example, there's a recent project that I'm working with the Northwest Minnesota Foundation, and it's at the top of mind, so I remember their specific values. So their values included trust, inclusion, collaboration, productivity, and well-being. So what you want to do is figure out 3 to 5 top values that you want to enact through your flexible hybrid work policy. Like, what do you actually want to accomplish? And then you go through the list and you say, okay, what does this actually mean in the context of flexible hybrid work? And so then you fill out, you enrich those, and those become your principles for flexible work. So what does it mean? And those are the principles that will guide your decision making. So whenever you're coming to a decision, you look at those 5 principles and think about, okay, here's what each of those principles mean, and how do I enact policies that would align with these principles. So you have each individual manager thinking about these principles. That makes it much easier to make a decision. That's kind of the first step.
So just to go deeper into that first step. So let's use that example you gave, the organization, I think it was in Minnesota, you said. The values you shared, how did those values turn into guiding principle? Like maybe you can give an example of one value and a principle that came out of it, just to bring it to life a little bit in terms of how that might impact decision making.
Sure. So let's say inclusion. There are a number of aspects of what inclusion might involve. One aspect of inclusion that we focused on a lot is hybrid meetings. So they have staff who work remotely. They have staff who work at some of the time. They have staff who work in the office. So how do you make sure to have a hybrid meeting where you're going to have staff who are coming in remotely not be treated as second-class citizens? That's going to be an important aspect of inclusion, honestly, at pretty much every company that does a hybrid modality. But here, that was one aspect. An aspect that's very specific to Northwest Minnesota Foundation is that they have a number of staff who are working in various regions of the Northwest Minnesota who are not working in the central office. And they often feel excluded from these meetings, not sufficiently included. They're not considered, their voices aren't heard. So another important principle of inclusion was to really focus on the voices and making sure to represent the regional staff in the when you're thinking about hybrid flexible work policy. So those are going to be some examples of what that means. So two different, so that inclusion, and there's a number of other things about inclusion which I can go into. But that's kind of what you want to be thinking about. Something that's hybrid meetings is going to be relevant to the large majority of companies, but some aspects are going to be very specific and relevant to only a specific company or a subset of companies.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. So you take those values, you then can extrapolate from them guiding principles around. So, for example, inclusivity, that we want to make sure that our people feel included, even if they are remote or not in the office, and meetings and other settings. And you use that to then drive the decision process around how do we approach hybrid. Is that right?
Yes. So that's the first step. So that's the leadership vision. Then what you want to do is you want to use that to inform a survey of the staff. So you use those principles and the kind of behaviors associated with those principles, as well as some other questions which are generally relevant to hybrid work, like where do you feel more productive and so on, what kind of office setup do you want? And you do a survey of staff members and you get their feedback on these principles and other questions relevant to flexible and hybrid work. Then you go deeper on the answers and you do qualitative and quantitative answers. Then you go deeper and do focus groups with staff members. So that's each of the, you want focus groups to see what the staff member, why they're answering questions the way they're answering. And so then you get that information back to the leadership team and you revise the principles to the extent that they should be revised in order to get that feedback and input from staff members.
You know,
So
it
there it
strikes me
goes.
that even as sorry to interrupt, it strikes me that even as you describe it, that I wonder how many companies are even getting the input from employees in the first place, right? Like it's almost presupposed in the way you describe it that there's comfort opening up this question and asking employees for survey and then focus group and having them so involved in the co-creation of the process. I think some companies probably approach this as leadership as a point of view or CEO as a point of view, and therefore it is what it is. Why is that so important, or in terms of the process, to actually go through that survey and focus group work, et cetera, to understand the employee perspective on this?
So several reasons. One is for the data itself, and another one is for employee input and buy-in. So let's talk about the data itself. When you're thinking about the CEO or the leadership team, they have a certain perspective, but they would naturally find it very hard to empathize with the employee perspective. Employees are very different and are functioning differently. They have a different experience. So you really want to understand if you care about employee retention and recruitment and engagement and morale and so on, if you care about these things, then you want to understand that your perspective as a leader will be just inherently different from the perspective of employees. And you want to get their feedback and input if you want to make a good decision. In the same way, when you're thinking about customers, you might have a point of view on what your customers want. But if you're just going to have a waterfall approach and just create a product from scratch, not market tested, and just put it out there, you're probably not going to be nearly as successful as you would be if you actually market test the product and see if there's a fit of product to market. That's a similar idea about any sort of policy that you want for your employees, especially something as big and major and something that's completely different than previous patterns of being as flexible and hybrid work. We don't have experience with it. So if you think that you will get it right in the first place without getting employee input and buy-in, that's a very big problem. And that's an incredibly arrogant approach. It really reminds me of what happened with Amazon when they just said, well, we're going to just talk among the leadership team, and Andy, Jesse, and so on decided that 3 days a week in the office is great, and we don't have data to back it up, but we just feel that it's the right thing to do. So that's
It's
really
so funny that you mentioned Amazon too, because Amazon is such a successful company, and over time, a huge part of that growth is the customer obsession, right? Constantly thinking about the customer and how do you improve value proposition to customer. I'm going to guess that most companies do not think of hybrid work as a product for their employees the way they think about products that they deliver to customers. But you're right, it's a really interesting comparison. If you were to think about it that way, as a product that you put out a V1 of, and then it gets better and you improve and iterate based on feedback, that mentality probably would get companies a lot closer to something that feels good and is effective for everybody versus thinking about it as policy.
Exactly. And you want to, especially something that's in thinking about a policy, you want to think about employee experience as just as valuable as customer experience. I mean, how many companies say that our employees are number one source of value, right? Our employees are the key that drive the company. But if you're not thinking about their experience and not trying to improve their experience, you're really putting the lie to your own words. That's really not the source of value. You're not really valuing them if you're not really getting their feedback, if you're not treating employee experience just as important as you're treating customer experience.
Yeah,
that's kind of the experiential angle, right? Like the other angle that you want to always be thinking about in this case is buy-in. So buy-in, engagement. You want employees to feel like they had input, because inevitably your policy, whatever you choose, will not fit everyone. Not everyone will agree, not everyone will be comfortable with it. But we have extensive research coming from behavioral science and other sources showing that if people have feedback and input, if they have a chance for their voices to be heard and considered, then they are going to be much more likely to accept and align and not resist whatever the final outcome will be, even if it doesn't fit their preferences. And that's a very fundamental, that's a very basic aspect of human psychology. So we're talking about human psychology, fundamental aspect of human psychology. So if you miss that, if you don't consider that, if you don't do that, you'll have so much more employee resistance and so much more employee opposition than if you do that, whatever the final outcome of your policy would be.
Makes perfect sense. So if I think about where we're at in this process, so we've talked about a first phase, which is let's think about our values. Let's turn them into a first version of guiding principles to use as like our foundation for thinking, if you will. Sounds like there's a meaningful second step, which is employee feedback and buy-in, survey, focus groups, quantitative and qualitative discussion, present that back to leadership, revisit guiding principles. At that point, what happens? How do you take it forward from there?
Yes. So you have the employee feedback, you have the survey, you have focus groups. So you do write that up into a report, present to the leadership team, and then once the leadership team uses that to revise the principles to the extent that that's necessary, what I do is I work with the leadership team to develop a roadmap to implementing the eventual policy. Like, what are the behaviors associated with flexible and hybrid work? So, for example, what kind of communication principles? Like, a big challenge is communicating effectively. Very often, people are overwhelmed with the number of meetings they have, and they don't realize that you don't need to have meetings for all sorts of communication. What I teach my clients is that you really need to think about your communication in 3 buckets. The communication that's most clear, most collaborative, most relationship building, but also most expensive is in-person and synchronous. You definitely have a full reading of body language, tone. It's great for more intense meetings, for more intense discussions, decision making, maybe conflict resolution, performance evaluation conversations. But you have to be in the office and you have to coordinate with each other. So that's pretty expensive. The next bucket is going to be moderately collaborative, moderately relationship building, and moderately expensive, which is virtual and synchronous. So at the same time, video conferences, phone calls. That's going to be, again, for activities that you still want some synchronicity for, but you don't need as much. It's not as important. And the least costly bucket and the least collaborative is going to be asynchronous. And within that bucket, it's not only going to be emails and Microsoft messages and Slack messages, but also voicemail and video messages, which you can use to convey nuance and body language and emotions. And so the crucial thing is to try to push down communication down those buckets into the least costly bucket. So focusing on making the communication as least costly as possible while still accomplishing the goal. And that's something once organizations go through several cycles of that and they learn how to do that, that flywheel gets going and their communication becomes much, much more effective. And they spend much less time in meetings. Their communication becomes much quicker and more coordinated. And so that's just one aspect out of what a flexible hybrid roadmap needs to look like. You want to train people on hybrid meetings. You want to train people on that communication. You want to create core common hours where people respond quickly, because that's one of the big complaints to messages when they're working remotely, especially. So you want to have a number of standardizations for what communication channels you use for what purpose, what you use email for, what you use Slack for, Microsoft Teams, whatever, texts. So all of that needs to be coordinated and communicated effectively. And that's where you create a guidebook, a flexible hybrid roadmap that will be the kind of specific behaviors associated with the principles.
And so you talked about, I guess, one pillar of that, which would be communication and how we communicate as an organization. What are some of the other pillars in that guidebook, so to speak? And we don't have to go deep into all of them, but like, what are the other ones that companies should be thinking about in terms of having a clearly communicated, maybe written down point of view on how we do this as an organization in a flexible work context?
Yes, so one is communication. Let's talk about another one, which is thinking about fundamental question of in-office attendance. Like, why do you come to the office? And what is the point of coming to the office versus working remotely? Like, what is that about? And so when I talk to clients, I teach them that the best things to do in the office are things that require more intense forms of coordination. So we talked a little bit about them, the collaboration, decision-making, and so on, socializing and team building, mentoring for junior staff, especially early onward in their experience, onboarding. Things that are better done at home is individual head-down work, is things like asynchronous communication, and also video conference calls, phone calls. You don't need to be in the office and distracting everyone with your video conference calls. So then we talk about, okay, how do we arrange people's schedules in such a way as to minimize the commute while getting things done in the office that are best done in the office? And so that is a fundamental aspect of communication. Usually what I encourage them to do is have a team-driven approach, so a team-led approach, where individual teams make a decision on what works best for them. And then with some perhaps coordination with their department, so maybe having one day a week when everyone comes to the office, or one day a month, or 2 days a month when everyone comes to the office, and having something like the other teams decide on what works best for them. Some engineers, for example, they might want to come in at the beginning of a sprint and at the end of a sprint. When you have accountants, they might want to come in for several days at the end of a month to close the books, but not come in during the rest of the time. Salespeople generally want to spend more time in the office. They get energized by being around each other. So that's also according to roles. What kind of roles do people have? And so you want to talk about coming together in the office. That's another area. A third area is going to be coordination and collaboration across departments and teams. So that's a very big topic of conversation, especially among support teams. So when they want to coordinate and communicate with other departments, how do we coordinate with them? How do we communicate with them? And so what I do is I have the heads of departments and teams work out a mapping communication with each other and coordination with each other. How do you coordinate? How do you communicate? How do you make sure that communication and coordination is least costly? So pushing it down into those three buckets, pushing it and making sure that there's established channels so that people don't resent each other and that you still get things done across the organization. So there's that coordination piece. And there's a number of other pieces. Like, for example, like what does your office space look like would be a fourth pillar. And so that's kind of an office space plan. What do you want in the office? Thinking about, okay, you want to spend coordinating, collaborating, then you probably don't need individual office spaces for individual staff. And people have to come to accept that because it's a really great cost reduction if you are willing to do that, to have hot desking and to have more collaboration spaces and stuff. So that's a fourth pillar. So there's a number of pillars like that you want to go through in your flexible hybrid roadmap to decide on what will be the guidebook for people.
I mean, it strikes me that it's a very activity-based way of thinking about it, right? In terms of what activities are best done in the office, how often do those take place? As a result, how often should we be there? What activities don't require synchronous work? And as a result, we can change the way that we approach that either within our team or across teams. What does the output look like? Is it almost in the guidebook a visual of, hey, we come into the office for these types of activities at these times, and this is how we collaborate team to team? Is that am I understanding correctly? Kind of like what that looks like in practice at the end?
Yes, it's broad principles. Plus, each team gets to make some of its own decisions within that context. So they establish a team level agreement where the teams decide, okay, here are the broad principles that we discussed. Here are some guidelines for behaviors. Here's what we do in communication. We set some core hours. We have this mapping. But each team can set some of its own core hours within the broad guidelines. Each team can have some of its own principles. Here's how we use different channels of communication within this team. And here's how coordinate and communicate within this team. Then we also talk about, okay, let's have a personal user manual for each individual person to understand how they prefer to communicate and coordinate, because it's going to be a little bit different for different people. And so it's not so important for members of your own team, but it's very valuable for having people in different teams try to get a hold of other people in teams elsewhere. So when you need to get a hold of somebody else, you can just pull up their personal user manual, their preference for communication and coordination, what their timeline is. So for example, if you have core hours of 12 to 3 p.m. and you set that across the company, you can set it across the company, you can set it across teams. But if you set it across the company, some people would prefer to work from 12 to 9. Some people would prefer to work from 5 to 3 p.m. And those are valuable things to know. And so you can use that to try to schedule meetings, to coordinate with each other, to collaborate if you have that personal user manual to know what different people prefer across the organization. So you want to establish those. So it's going to be a broad guideline for people within the organization. And within that context of those broad guidelines, different teams will establish team level agreements for what those specific teams will do around hybrid work and flexible work.
Got it. So it's almost like a stack. If I'm thinking about this correctly, you've got guiding principles at the top that are bought into by both leadership and by employees based on the feedback and input that they gave along the way. That gives way to team level agreements on explicitly how you implement it at that team. Individuals have a user manual to understand their specific preferences around that within that broader construct. As you wrap all that together, how do organizations measure it? How do you encourage them to look at it over time and think about like whether it's working?
Yeah, so that's the next step. So once you establish those principles, the next step is to establish metrics. So as part of the team level agreements, each team decides on what metrics they're going to be using to measure the effectiveness of that, which they revise every quarter. And they have to coordinate with HR to make sure that the metrics are going to be appropriate and aligned across the organization, generally speaking. So those metrics should be tied to their broader KPIs, if they use key performance indicators, or OKRs, if they use objectives and key results. So something that is definitely related to the desired output, as well as having some aspects specific to flexible and hybrid work, like how do we feel about our communication? Do we want to do a survey? Do we want to do feedback on how our communication is doing? How are we feeling about how often we're going to the office? Is this going well? Should we change it? So you want to have revision you want to have clear metrics that are coordinated with HR and have some standardization across the organization, as well as something that's going to be particular to each team. And you want to revise those every quarter to see how